Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining the Holocaust Center for Humanities Lunch and Learn program. I'm Alana Cohn-Kennedy, the Holocaust Center's Director of Education. Thank you to Parent Map Live and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Discovery Center for partnering with us on this program. Fair doesn't mean equal. Equality doesn't mean justice. Equality means giving everyone the same thing, but it can only work if everyone starts from the same place. Equity is about fairness. It's about making sure that people have access to the same opportunities. Last year, the Washington State Legislature passed the Holocaust Education Bill, strongly encouraging every public middle school, junior high school, and high school to teach about the Holocaust. The bill states, in addition to this study being a reaffirmation to never again permit such occurrences, studying this material is intended to examine the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and intolerance, and prepare students to be responsible citizens in a pluralistic democracy. All of us who teach and learn about the Holocaust, all of us who are interested in this history, recognize that the lessons of the Holocaust reach beyond this specific event. We have a responsibility to speak out, to act in whatever way we are able, to work towards a society that is equitable, where people have access to the same opportunities and where people are not prejudged because of the color of their skin. If we are really learning from the Holocaust, then we know that we cannot stand by. In an effort to address the enduring lessons of the Holocaust and to support the new legislation on Holocaust education, the Holocaust Center for Humanity is launching a new online platform of best practices, which will offer suggested unit outlines, lesson plans, and activities. These lessons and activities aim to challenge students to think critically about our society and to empower them to speak out against injustice. The new best practices platform will be launched on our website in August. I'm grateful to my colleague, Paul Regelbrug, our Professional Development and Curriculum Coordinator, who introduced me to the three panelists we have with us today. Paul has been working with school districts across the state to begin implementing lessons on the Holocaust. These three women who are leading the charge in race and equity discussions in the sphere of education have been outspoken and supportive voices for Holocaust studies. Our country is at a turning point, and now is the time when we must address the systemic racism that pervades our society. Now is the time for tough conversations when we must ask the hard questions and be brave enough to risk making mistakes in an effort to really hear each other and to affect change. I thank our panelists for their willingness to be here today and to have these conversations with me. It is now my honor to introduce our panelists, Angela Jones, the CEO of Washington STEM, E-chieh Lin, the Director of Diversity and Community and Director of Hiring at University Prep, and Tanisha Brandon-Felder, the Director of Equity and Family Engagement at Shoreline School District. Our panelists will answer questions at the end of the program. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions at any time, and we will address as many as we can at the end of the program. Thank you so much for being here today, and to our panelists, we'll start with Angela. Would you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your role?
Sure. Thank you for having me here today. I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to amplify our voices. So I'm Angela Jones. I am CEO of Washington STEM. Many identities, actually. I'm a proud daughter, proud mother, and a proud grandmother, which is a big piece of my identity. Was a teacher, which is where I met Paul. And now serving as CEO of Washington STEM. I love the work where we get a chance to focus on equitable access to quality STEM education. And my team and I focus across the state of Washington through 10 networks, and we focus on target populations of students of color, girls in STEM, students in rural communities, and students living in low-income environments. As we look at Washington State, we are a high-tech state, but we're not seeing all of our students be able to keep pace with access to that quality STEM education and the credentials that help our students in Washington get family sustaining wages. So excited to be here today, passionate, long time person who has studied equity education and also led equity services at Spokane Public Schools in the past. So excited to serve on this panel alongside incredible people like our next person, E-chieh.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Alana, and thank you to the Holocaust Center for putting this together. I am a proud immigrant Taiwanese woman who is also an educator. I started doing equity work through education, trained as a fine arts teacher. So I taught in photography, sculpture, and visual arts, and then have been doing DA work for about the last 12 years. And that was really when I started to delve into my own identities and learn about myself. And that's kind of where it sparked in me wanting to do more work with students and adults around identity work, learning about equity and equity pedagogy. My work at University Prep has kind of stemmed through being a teacher, being an assistant director in our diversity office, and then now the director. So I've kind of moved through a few different phases. And as the director, I really look at the way that our school is an independent school, so it's not within the public system, how we can work on creating a more equitable system for our students of color that we're bringing in, as well as our faculty and staff. That's the hiring part of my job. That's not often correlated with diversity directors. Being a director of hiring is uncommon in many places. So I kind of look at the entire sphere of our school. I will say that we as a school are not quite there yet. We are working towards finding a system that is equitable for our community, but we're not quite there yet. So we're working towards that. I look at non-curricular programming, curricular programming, hiring, and then kind of our academic opportunity areas, and where we can create a space for students to be able to be at our school, to not face the stress of racial stress or religious stress or gender stress, to be able to learn in an environment that is that stress does not create places where they do not feel like they're able to perform or learn. So that's kind of the overview of my particular position. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tanisha. Thank you.
I'm honored to be here. Good afternoon. I'm honored to be in this space, getting to share energy with both Angela and E-chieh. Thank you for creating this panel. I'm so excited to be here. My name is Tanisha Brandon-Felder. My position is Director of Equity and Family Engagement in the Shoreline School District. And my journey has been through education. I started off as a classroom teacher with the intent of just wanting to change the world, basically. The idea that youth were kind of our future, and I still believe that really strongly. And my lens has always been a social justice kind of framework, the idea that if I could influence anyone to be an agent of change, whether they were 6 or 16, then I felt that was something that was worth doing, and using my classroom as a catalyst for that, and growing myself in the process. So my work started off as being a teacher that really believed very strongly in culturally responsive practices and social justice advocacy, and that kind of took me on a journey of then creating opportunities to lead adults and doing racial equity work with adults around creating their own awareness around how they show up in the classroom every single day with their students, with themselves, with their peers, and then how that impacts the school environment. And then that eventually led to the position that I have now, which is currently overseeing the equity work in our school district and also our family engagement work. My philosophy and my beliefs are really around the idea that it's the awareness piece, that people aren't always aware of what it is that they know and don't know, and creating an opportunity to be able to engage people in conversations that lead to systemic change is really what my goal is. I think that systemic transformation is possible, and that we are not above and beyond looking at our systems, examining them, and then redeveloping and redesigning them. with our most impacted youth in the middle and centering that work for us. And then in the work that I do in my district, also thinking about how that shows up for our staff and for our families. So when I think about the work, and I also had a chance to meet Paul as someone who came into my district and had a meeting and was kind of thinking about like, are there opportunities to explore how this work connects? And I was like, absolutely, there's always connections, and there's definite connections around the histories of how we look at oppression and how it's played out, and the lessons that we need to be paying attention to and learning so we don't repeat them.
Thank you so much to all of you for being a part of this panel today. And Tanisha, I really like what you said, where people aren't always aware of what they know and what they don't know. And I think that's really important to keep in mind for all of us listening and joining in today. And I think that's also maybe a good lead into the first question I have, which Tanisha, I'll address to you, but if anyone else wants to chime in, that's great. And that is, we're talking a lot about race right now in our country. And we also simultaneously hear the expression that race is just a social construct and that race doesn't really exist. Can you help us to better understand this?
Yeah, I like this question, mostly because I feel like it's the foundation which I start most of my work. And I won't argue with that. Race is definitely a social construct. The idea there is no biological factor that involved with that. It's not a scientific fact at all. So I'll give that to people. Like race is definitely a social construct. It was made up for very definite purposes, or history around how race was created. And I'd like to talk in terms of like the US, like there's a really definite reason why race was created and has been so profitable in our country specifically, on the backs of so many people. The thing that is really important to pay attention to, though, is that even though race is this kind of made up thing and all these things have been created based on race, racism is real. And the impacts of racism and the way that hierarchy works in race and has been created around the superiority of how whiteness looks in our country, then to the inferiority of how people of color have been positioned in our country, has really strong impacts and has impacts over our history. So when people kind of ask that question or make that statement, well, it's not really a real thing, why do we spend time talking about it? Or, if race is a social construct, can't we just, move it along? Can't we just ignore it? I would say, yeah, if we also didn't have the components of the oppression that's connected with race, if there wasn't the hierarchy or the idea of superiority and inferiority that was existing, then we could truly call it a social construct that we could redefine at any given time. But until we are able to get rid of that feeling, sentiment, impact, and have to really look at how racism is played out in our country, they belong together. And it isn't true, a real thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I'd like to move on. Here's our second question here. This one I'll direct to you, Angela. Actually, I'll direct it to any of you who'd like to respond. And that is, how have you seen your role and your goals change in the last few years, or even in the last few months, in the last few weeks, as our world seems to be changing so rapidly?
To be honest with you, my role hasn't changed since I was a little girl and aware of the skin that I've been living in. I've learned a lot along the way. I've grown in terms of how I then communicate with other people who don't look like me. And so I think it's more of intensified. So I've always been an advocate. I learned very early on in the education system to find my voice and advocate for the type of education I wanted and expected. I'm African-American and Filipina, but the world sees me, as Black in the space. And so I think now it's intensified is the word I would say, instead of really changed. I mean, it's a survival skill to understand how to navigate the systems that Tanisha was just talking about. And now it's me having to understand how I help people in this space where it's a new awakening for a lot of people. Even though, my people have struggled with this for 450 years, and we've held this sort of rage for 450 years, what does that mean then? And now I'm examining what's my responsibility in this space when I'm hurting And we're dealing with trauma that just keeps coming up, intergenerational trauma, to make sure that I can still care for allies who really are very well intentioned in this space. And so that's what I guess I would say, intensified versus changed.
Intensified versus changed. And does anyone else want to chime in on that?
Sure, Alana, I'll chime in a little bit. I'm thinking of chiming in because my experience has been different from Angela's, right? I came as an immigrant, and as an immigrant, and from many people that I've spoken to as immigrants, our goal was to put our heads down and just do our best and work and not engage. And I've had to take the time to actually find my voice and become the person that I am in my adult life. So like advocacy, activism has been more recent for me than for many people. And that's been a part of, I think my goal is to really work with the allies, because I learned to become and do the DEI work that I do because of becoming an ally. Being an ally to others was what really pushed me and charged me into doing what I'm doing. And I think in the last few months, thinking about how at least the role at my school has changed is how do we do and work with students and adults who are not used to this system, the very, like, you know, our system is a very white and majority system, and working within this online sphere is a little harder for some of our students. We provide support, in-person support, and it's not possible within this place. And so thinking about how do we do that in an online area has been a challenge to kind of work on creating those connections and creating community when we're not together. So.
Yeah, I would add that I think that the one thing that became pretty clear really quickly when schools were forced to close was how many obstacles have been created by the systems that we're sitting in, you know, self-created. And, you know, the obstacles that are kind of abstract when you're talking about it, like in a training or like, you know, just in a meeting, became very concrete when you're actually trying to figure out how to get students and families what they need to be successful, whatever success looks like during this time. I think also the recognition that in the middle of a pandemic, like trauma doesn't stop, loss doesn't stop, grief doesn't stop, like those things are continuing. And so what we saw in the middle of COVID-19, where we have the awareness now of what's been happening to Black bodies forever, it feels like, was intensified only because I think, you know, people were like, well, where else am I going to be? I have to be tuned into something. There's nowhere else to go. There's not really a lot of distractions. And in that way, you know, a lot of attention then was put on this really horrific thing that has happened. But we know it's not the first thing. And we know it's not the last thing, even since that happened. And so then the question becomes, what I've been seeing is then like, you know, what do we do right now? Like, how do we address it right now? And I've tried to also make sure that there's space, you know, to welcome in that new energy. Like what Angela's saying, you know, balance the new energy of people who are, you know, coming in, and also be reminded that there has been work that's been ongoing. There's systemic change that's in process. And in the attempt to do things quickly and impulsively, sometimes you kind of can damage the systemic longevity of what's possible. So just the balance of creating opportunities for building your own awareness and knowledge and skills, while also continuing the hard work that people have been putting in. And I'm standing on like the shoulders of my ancestors who put this work in place, you know, before me. And I want people to be able to stand on my shoulders also, the legacy I leave behind. But that can't happen if you're pushing me over in the process. So just the balance of wanting to make sure that we're doing it together and not re-marginalizing people in the process.
Yeah, I really appreciated what you all have said too, is that this is not the first time this has come around, that this is a long time coming, and that this is just almost a magnifying of what's already been existing, and the work continues. So in this kind of maybe reawakening, and Angela, I'll direct this one to you. What advice do you have for people wanting to move racial justice efforts forward in education, but who are newer to this space?
I have so many thoughts. And I actually would welcome from the other two panelists as well who are doing this work in a different way. I'm a blogger as well because that's just my therapy space. And so I actually put 2 blogs out on this because people just kept coming to me at a volume I couldn't manage and asking me, Angela, what should I do? Tell me what to do. What's my next step? I want to be an ally. I want to be supportive. And it was everything from acquaintances to dear family friends. And that's a lot to manage, even when we're not in this space. And so I put 2 blogs out there. One that's called Use Your Outside Voice, that, don't just tell me. I need you to talk with people who don't look like me, who have positions of influence and power, because we as humans, we're the ones that uphold the systems. We're the ones that keep perpetuating systems. So what are some conscious choices we're going to make when we're looking at our workplace processes? What are some conscious choices when you're talking with your families? Even something as small as that joke is not okay. As we talk about the education system, how are you doing pedagogy, pedagogy for all? How are you making sure how you outreach to parents, how you teach students is culturally appropriate, is culturally responsive? How are we making decisions about curriculum? So there are some little things and some big things that we need people to do. And it all starts with examining your heart. If you don't examine your heart and your head, and you're going through the motions and you put things in place and heart is not in it, it doesn't matter. And we've seen that. We've had law after law after law that talks about hate crimes, that talks about anti-discrimination, that, when we went through the civil rights movement, got acts passed. But as a nation, I wouldn't say our hearts were 100% in it. There were people who said, yikes, slavery's bad, we shouldn't do that. Yikes, Jim Crow laws are bad, we shouldn't do that. But we have to be all in heart, and then slowly learn. So, example I gave earlier, people can talk to us, and that's fine. A lot of us are in this as professionals, but really think about who you're asking. There's a cultural tax that people of color bear when things like this happen, and people want to go straight to that one friend that they have. And obviously you have those relationships, but be gentle and be aware of what your Black and brown friends are going through right now. So that's one thing I would ask. And Google something, look on the internet. If you come to me and say, I read this article, and I read this article, and I read this article, and I watched this video, and Angela, I'm still struggling with some things, I just want to bounce off of you, I will receive that so much better than tell me where to start. And the other piece is there are people like you and your organization that literally have volumes of information and opportunities to engage. Like I've been reading your encyclopedia that you have out there, your survivor encyclopedia. And so make some conscious, intentional efforts and understand where you fall on the continuum of learning and commit every day. I met with my team, my staff earlier today, and just said, tell me one thing in this challenging time that's giving you hope. And someone said, I have hope that we're not actually lazy activists, that in this moment, it's not going to be this moment, we're going to continue and continue and continue. And another staff member say, I'm raising anti-racist children. That's my commitment. So find your commitment, find your space, and grow from there.
I think I'd like to add, that was absolutely amazing and wonderful, Angela. Thank you for sharing. I think for me, what I would like to add is that people need to examine themselves, right? You need to examine your own identities, think about which identities you have that are privileged and which ones that could be oppressed, right? And also examine how you have lived your life through those different identities. That is a way for people to do their own work, because if you don't do your work and you just keep asking others to help you, you are not actually engaging in this work wholeheartedly. I think reading books is great, but how does that connect to you? How does that connect to how you've interacted with other people, how you've engaged others? That, I think, is a part of a lesson that I think many people need to think about.
Like yes and yes, like those are some strong statements, and I only want to say like I agree 100%. I think the authenticity behind the why, you know, why is it important to you? What is the purpose that's going to serve in your life as you are seeking out this knowledge, or even asking, you know, me or whoever else that person is in your life, what do you do with that? And I really appreciate the Google piece. Like I like to say, you know, if nothing else, start with that first. Because it is hard then to take in a question that you're kind of wondering, could you have asked that question or found that question, you know, on your own? I appreciate the opportunity for you people to do their own work first and then come with me with like, you know, some conversation opportunities. Engaging in the conversation to me is where the growth actually is possible. Starting off scratch where I have to teach you then about how you should care about who I am feels a little bit oppressive, I'll just say that.
Thank you. Tanisha, if you're willing, I want to start with you on this one, but please, anybody, I encourage you to help us out here. I've heard in the last 2 weeks, several times, people use the phrase reverse discrimination. What do you say to people who claim reverse discrimination? How do you navigate this?
I think it's hard to have that conversation without understanding the structure of power and the impact that power and positionality has had in our country. When I hear that statement specifically, what it kind of brings up to me is the first thing I want to ask is, do you know the history of how our country has come to be? Like how, starting from the very beginning, where the literal land was taken from indigenous people. So then that people then could have homesteading, you know, and moving forward and all these expansions that were happening. I want to know where the reverse discrimination might have lived in that situation. Was there a power then where enough indigenous people would have been able to impact the livelihood and outcome of the white dominant group that came in then to take that? And I would use that same example across the board. You know, Angela mentioned, like, you know, Jim Crow South during that time period. When you have enough power to be able to truly influence the outcome, the everyday living experience of a group of people, to the detriment, you know, to the true of like just pulling away resources, pulling away livelihoods, pulling away intended outcomes, until that power exists, it can't really be reversed. And I'm saying that in terms of like, if there is a white dominance that's existed in our country, and I'm not just even talking about white people, I'm talking about a white culture that has created a system that has really pushed people of color away from opportunities, from access, from resources, like the visual that you showed at the beginning, Alana. If that is really something that has happened, and we know that it has because we have history that's shown us over and over again, we don't have examples where that has lived the same way in our country, where groups of people of color have been able to ultimately change the entire trajectory for whiteness in our country. And I think that comes, that question or that statement comes up from a fear there's too much of centering then of people of color, of indigenous people in ways that have never really been centered before, because it then threatens the whiteness that exists. That's my first response to that. I'd love to hear like either Angela or E-chieh would say or think.
Actually, no, I agree with you, Tanisha. And it's interesting, years ago, and I don't know if the definition has changed, but you know, it's been a while since I've been in the classroom, but we were, you know, looked at a National Education Association definition that said, you know, race is privilege plus power. And that's the way we defined it as we looked at equity in education. And so thinking about, you know, that piece of, you know, who has that privilege and who has that power? Well, it really still is a white dominant culture power base. And so even people may say, but Angela, like, you're a CEO. Yes, and when I sit at the table with other CEOs, they tend to not look like me, even in the nonprofit space. And so, you know, thinking about that, you know, and there's a privilege where, you know, some people can move in and out of different circles and power bases that I can't because of my skin color. And so until those pieces, you know, have been eradicated, like you've talked about, You know, I don't believe in reverse racism, flat out.
And I think I will add to that. I've shared with some of my students that I have to code switch in all the different spaces that I go into, right? And until I don't have to do that, I'm not sure that reverse racism is not a thing.
Thank you.
If
Thank
people
you.
wanted to go further and deep with that, Ibram X. Kendi has a nice section in his book. It's both in Stamp, the remix by Jason Reynolds, and also in How to Be an Anti-Racist.
Would you, Tanisha, would you be willing to type that into the chat so
Yeah.
our attendees can
Sure.
find it? Yeah, thank you. So E-chieh, for this next question, I'll direct it towards you. Is there systemic racism in education? I think we probably know the answer to that. And how so? And what or should educators do to help create change?
Thank you, Alana. I would say yes, there is systemic racism in our education. A lot of our curriculum is based on a European white colonial viewpoint of history. When we leave out the history and voices and perspectives of oppressed people, we're teaching a racist system because we're only teaching one perspective. I think a lot of educators have tried and to incorporate more voices within their education. And I think it's easier in systems like my school, where it's an independent school. It doesn't have to follow a particular curriculum to be able to do that. And I looked, there's a lot of different resources and books for educators to connect to that are not the history books that I grew up with in the Washington State education system, like the Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, or an African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz, the BLM 2020 Curriculum Resource Guide, there's a Black History Month library that a website called Educate Yourself put together. The 1619 Times Magazine project that Nicole Hannah-Jones put together. There's a lot of resources that educators can reach out to, connect with, and bring those voices and perspectives in that would change the way that we educate our students, to help students see themselves within education, right? Holocaust education is something that's hugely important because, like many of you have said today, the lessons from that are the ones that should be taken away. We should never, ever be repeating what happened in the Holocaust. Those lessons should be connected to what's happening now. A lot of the racism, the religious oppression that's happening then happens now. So think about how to connect those, right? If you're looking for different perspectives, there are so many writers now that are really thinking about how to engage history in that way. For subjects that are not history and English, I know when I taught fine arts, I tried to make sure that if I'm teaching about a particular type of sculpture, I'm looking at sculpture around the world at the same time, because I want students to be able to recognize that there's more than one way to create a sculpture or one perspective. And I think that it takes effort to look for those, right? It takes your willingness and engagement to do that. The other thing that I think is important is bringing in those personal perspectives. Books like Night by Elie Wiesel. The Paper Daughter was one that was huge for me as an immigrant Asian person. The Hate U Give, Brooklyn Dreams, those perspectives really helped students connect what is that intellectual aspect to what is the heart and that experience. And they often, at least, I'll speak from my perspective. For me, I saw myself through Elaine Marr's book, Paper Daughter, because I had never seen myself in any other place through my entire education. I was 28 years old when that happened. And we don't ever want that for any of our students, to have to wait until they're in their adulthood to see themselves through their education.
You just listed off the most incredible list of resources for people to check out. There were so many fantastic authors and titles. Would you be willing to either send those to me later and I can post them, or if you have a chance during this conversation, post a few of them in the chat for the attendees, and we can, I know lots of people are asking, so we want to make sure they have access to those. But
I'd be happy to try to do both.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Thank you so much. Well, this leads us in, that's a good segue into our next question, which I'll direct to you, Angela, which is, if you were considering education reform and how we teach history, what changes would you make?
Oh, I love this question because I'm always considering education reform. You know, E-chieh and Tanisha have both talked about curriculum, so I'm not going to necessarily delve into that piece of it. But I really want to delve into the how we do things. Right now, we are stuck in yet another construct that subjects should be taught separately. You know, you do math here, and you do English here, and you do social studies here, and you do language here, or whatever the case may be. And, you know, I'm going to use this as an example. This is our forum to learn right now. And we're using our communication skills, we're using some technology skills, so yay STEM education, you know, in here. And we're also talking about, you know, social studies, we're talking about English, we're infusing this because that's really how the world works. We don't sit at work and go, right now I'm only using my math skills, and in a moment I'm going to move over to my financial skills that I learned in my business class. We integrate everything in our world, yet that's not how we teach students. And so one of my points would be, you know, I would love to find a way to integrate all of our subjects into one in a way that makes sense to students. And then E-chieh actually brought this up as well, is, you know, there also needs to be a way to connect the things that are happening in history. There have been and continue to be atrocities, you know, in the history of the world. And so, you know, the things we should have learned from the Holocaust, the things we should have learned from Japanese internment, the things we should have learned from slavery, and all of those point right back to us as humans, but that's not how we teach history. We don't connect them that way. Another example, you know, let's go back 100 years, and right now we're in the midst of a pandemic. 100 years ago, they were in the midst of a pandemic, and we teach things separately because we're in the midst of a pandemic. We are in the midst of the women's suffrage movement. We are in the midst of intense racism and lynchings in America, and on the eve of the Harlem Renaissance. We're not teaching it that way. We're not talking about it that way to say, what did we learn then, and what can we continue then to learn now? Someone in the chat said, and I love this, that they think about it as, or they were taught, you know, how can we be good ancestors? So what are we teaching and leaving behind now? And I thought that was absolutely brilliant and worth sharing. You know, finally, teaching in a way, and being good ancestors, teaching in a way that's good for our kids. My son's 8th grade teacher uses current events, connects them to past events to help my son understand what's different and what's the same. And then part of the assignment is now sit down with your family and talk about it. So we've had multi-generational conversations, and from different viewpoints of my dad growing up in the segregated South, me growing up at this time of, you know, multiculturalism, I'm multiracial, like, you know, what does that mean? And then my son, where, you know, I think this generation actually has talked a little less about race and talks more about how do we connect as people, but now that's all come to a head. So all of these generations right now, you know, how do we reframe history? And we have an opportunity right now when we're reimagining school, because we've all had to be home and be homeschool parents overnight. How do we reimagine it? So very passionate about how can we really integrate the learning across subject areas and then connect history, because we don't seem to be learning from it.
I just want to add, like, I love what you just said about the integration piece and how we siloed that, like in a doesn't make any sense how that happens. You think about it, when you say it out loud, it's like, that makes no sense. Why would we do that? Because life is like so integrated. My daughter's in 7th grade, and watching her naturally integrate that. She's a songwriter, she's a performer, she is an athlete. And she's kind of, you know, we started off trying to do the traditional, you know, language arts time, you know, time to read, time to write or whatever. but really what ended up happening was like, okay, you know, she's creating a song, she's writing the music to go with that, she's finding the beats to do that, she's recording that, then turning that into like a video. Like there's so many different skills that are happening based off lots of different like techniques and like, you know, real content area that if it was then put into a classroom setting, the question would be, would it be honored? Would it be valued? Would it be seen for what it was? Or would it be considered off task? And so I think like reframing how we look at the natural skills and talents and the things that we can nurture in our students that really truly bring in all the different pieces of who they are and the value is put on them is really like, that would be a life changer. That would be transformational in itself.
Great, these are such amazing ideas. So building on that, and because we're coming from the lens of the Holocaust Center for Humanity, could any of you talk about how Holocaust education could be used in your schools or your districts or your roles to help work towards these goals of equity and education?
I was part of the book-to-book program this summer. Well, this summer, I feel like it was summertime, only school year, the school year for my daughter. When Paul had talked about that program and Whitebird was one of the choices and she already loved Wonder. It felt like a nice connection for her. She also loves graphic novels. And part of it, honestly, was to kind of see like, how would I then be able to, you know, how could I apply in my school district? I want to see what it looks like with a 7th grade student. And how well she was able to connect with it and the educator resource that came with that. And then there was also an online Zoom session for the young readers that were engaged with that book. The connections that I saw anyway, and witnessed, and the way that she was experiencing it, it just went across so many different topics, themes, and the impact. And I think that there's an empathy piece that definitely was shown. So I can see how SEL connects directly to this. But thinking about, you know, what are ways in which we can emphasize social emotional learning and connections with people around not just like emotions, but also relationships, the impact of relationships, the impact of what it means to other someone versus being inclusive. I could see where you start taking a common text and then growing into like the different things that are happening around you. Because I love how in the book they connected to some real current things that are happening as well. So for me, it's like I said from the beginning when Paul came and was talking to myself and our director of teaching and learning, it wasn't a stretch around like where does it fit. It was more about like, look how complementary it can be. We talk about things like ethnic studies and we talk about things of culturally responsive, you know, practices. That means that stories are told in ways where people have a chance to create these windows and mirror opportunities where I can then learn about other cultures and people that maybe I don't have access to in a way that allows me then to learn more about who I am as well. So I saw a really nice, strong connection to it. And that's like one of many resources. That's one that I just kind of was looking at the last couple of months, specifically through the eyes of the youth.
I think that Tanisha hit on a huge point about Holocaust education that we really need to kind of think about in the way that we teach is the aspect of not othering someone, right? That is a part of where bullying comes in. It's a part of all aspects of like differing, trying to make someone different than you and isolating them from that. And if we can take that as what can happen when a entire governmental system or the takeover of a system pushes and makes this a group this way, maybe that is a way that we can help create empathy with for students to kind of think about why wouldn't we want to value difference, right? Why wouldn't we want to say our differences are what make us unique and awesome and wonderful and beautiful, and why can't we use that to learn about each other instead of saying I'm going to push you aside because you're different than me, and that way, you know, I'm better than you.
Wonderful, thank you. We have so many questions from attendees, so I want to make sure we have lots of time to address some of these. I'll I'll pick a few and I'll read them out loud, and we'll just open it up to anyone who wants to answer that particular question. One of the ones that we got kind of early on in the discussion was, it's from Shane, and I'll just read it. It says, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on what changes should be made within PTAs to create equity amongst members and how to best utilize school PTAs in anti-racism work.
I guess I'll take that one. And then feel free to chime in. I'm just thinking, because that's something that I know coming from the public school sector. So yeah, you know, there's a climate that can consist or exist around what we sometimes call the powerhouse of PTA. And I want to say that I'm also on a PTA as a parent. I created my own position, which is the Diversity and Outreach Chair, because there was no people of color. Even though we have quite a few students of color and families of color in our school, there wasn't any of that on the board, and I know why. And I also wanted to make sure that other people never felt intimidated or felt like they didn't have a space to be able to advocate for their kids and their education. I think that one of the pieces that I really appreciate around groups of color that come together and organize for change and advocacy with their kids is the collectivism model. The idea that I only can be because we are. And I feel like the individualistic kind of way that PTAs can run can be really divisive, and it does create that inequity, you know, just because of the way that's formatted. I would love to challenge PTAs and districts to create a collectivist model. If we're raising funds, can we raise funds collectively? Can those funds then be dispersed out, you know, collectively to all the students that are in our district? I think because things are so school bound and school focused, it becomes really more about what can I do for my school? And I get that. You want resources in your school. You want to be able to give back, you know, to your kid and their experience. But I also think about what about the kid across the district who may not have the same access or same kind of PTA able to raise those kind of funds, and why can they not have? And that piece, I want to go back to that visual again that you showed at the beginning with the boxes. There has to be also some kind of understanding that just because I give you a little bit doesn't mean I'm losing a whole bunch, but there's enough to kind of give around. So I do believe that there is so much work that can be done in our PTA system in general, although I have to also say that they're doing some work. I've seen handbooks that PTAs have published, like, you know, the National has a whole diversity and equity handbook. What I'd love to see is how we are actually implementing that.
I think diversifying our PTA is a huge aspect, right? Our school, we call it parent council, but they're very, very white. And in the last 3-4 years, they've recognized it, and they've been trying to reach out and engage more parents of color. But the aspect that we've really pushed our parent council recruiters is that if you expect them to come to you, that is a bad expectation. You should go to them. You should be able to meet them where they feel comfortable, where it's a place that they want to be able to engage in the work that you want to do. And don't just put us in the diversity committees. Like, it's not helpful if we're all sitting in the diversity community because we're just doing the work with ourselves. Engage us in other aspects, right? So I think that that's a part of the PTA, right? They're like, oh, you're a person of color. Oh, here's the diversity committee. Please come sit on this committee. And it's like, thank you. And I can do other things too. So.
Thank you. I think that's really important. There's a question that came in on Facebook, and it says, what's the best way to deal with different ethnic groups who've experienced racism and atrocities, who seem to be competing as to who has suffered the most?
There is one of the things that my friends and I talk about is there's healing that has to happen among all of our communities that really hasn't taken place. And so I can only speak for the Black community of, we've got to start from a place of healing as we also look at what sustainability for generations looks like. And healing also means understanding that there are other things that have happened to other people groups and where those connections are, and then how we come together. For example, I talk to a lot of people who say, but the construct labels me as white, but I have an Irish background and this is what happened to my people, or I have a German background and this is what happened to my people, and so on and so on. And so when we have those conversations, we manage those in a way that doesn't say your hurt is better than mine, or or worse things happen to my people than your people. It's more of a, okay, we've come to a common understanding, and in America, this is still what this means. And so I think people have to be willing to have tough conversations right now, because I've had, friends who, are First Nations who, atrocities have happened to their people as well. But in this space right now, they're coming to me and saying, Angela, I'm so sorry. What can I do? Knowing that that's happened. And, for you all to host this, knowing the atrocities that have happened, but you're willing to center us right now in the space around what's happening, to Black communities across America. And so this right here, what you're doing and what you're leading, is the perfect example of how we make space for each other. And again, continue to make the connections, because we can't continue this work and be disconnected to say like, oh, well, the Holocaust wasn't as bad as slavery. We will never get anywhere as common people making those arguments. It's really making space for all of us to acknowledge hurt and then figure out how we heal and move forward.
Just to build on one of the points that you said, one of the guidelines that we teach to educators who are teaching about the Holocaust is that you cannot compare pain, that everything needs to sit in itself. We can't say that the Holocaust was the worst atrocity to ever occur, that these kinds of comparisons don't get us anywhere. I hear what you're saying. I think that's really important. So here's another question that came in. This one came in from Jenny Davidson, and she writes, teachers have equity and race trainings. What do you recommend for parents? Because trainings are so helpful for teachers, I know it would help parents to work with their children. What kind of trainings for parents at school do you recommend, or are there people you recommend to go to? And it continues on a little bit.
Well, coincidentally, not to plug myself at all, but I am doing a series of race and equity trainings for parents this summer. You can look at southendstories.com is the website for that. And that's through a nonprofit organization, just because I feel like it's something that people were asking about. I agree that there need to be opportunities that are focusing in on families, and there are quite a few organizations that do provide trainings that are really geared towards helping families unpack the conversations around race and how to talk to your children. One that I would just recommend that I've also participated in is the Hilltop Preschool Cooperative. They are really strong in this work and lead lots of family kind of opportunities. But another thing is kind of building your own cultural aperture. So if you are following different people on Instagram or Twitter or whatever kind of social media that you use, kind of breaking outside of your own social norm box and thinking about, where can I find other resources? Those things will start coming across your feed. You'll start seeing those resources kind of pop up. And so if I want to find different trainings of things I'm interested in, you just do it one time, and all of a sudden you can't keep your your inbox is full all the time. So I would look for those opportunities and just think about what is it that you're interested in. And some of our top leaders right now in this work are like almost giving away their webinars for free. So there's a lot of resources that are available.
I think for those parents and families that are in workplaces, your workplaces often have employee resource groups that are either affinity group based or not all of them, but some of them do. And if they don't, approach your HR department and ask to create those. I think those are great learning spaces as well. A lot of those spaces don't only focus on the work that is within the organization that you're in. There's a lot more talk around how your identity develops within those spaces.
Yeah, my team, we actually have a professionals of color affinity group at Washington STEM, and we have a white ally group because we want everybody to be able to express themselves in a space that feels safe. And then we do come together as a team and talk about a few things. But there are times when some of my white staff have said, like, I have questions, but I'm like, is that going to be offensive? I just want to be able to talk some things through in a space. And so we absolutely support that.
Well, as one of the last question, actually this is the last question I'll ask to each one of you, and it came in through our Zoom chat here, and it was, if you could recommend one book for people to read, what would you recommend? We listed lots of books, and we'll try and make this entire list available to everyone, but if you could boil it down, what would it be?
I love So You Want to Talk About Race? I think it's a really good like intro, like here we go. Yomo Luo. And I'll put it in the box.
That's what I was thinking about too. It's an amazing intro for families, for adults to really think about how to start engaging in that work. But let me think a little bit more for my book.
I don't have just one book. Honestly, there's so many. I mean, if you wanted me to answer honestly, like, you know, I'd say like there's so many things. There's even articles and short things, and there's even fiction. We can also learn, because a lot of times people are telling their stories, like any of Toni Morrison's work. She's telling her story. I just read a book called Red at the Bone, which talks about intergenerational racism and what they endured in the bombing of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So understanding that we had this place. And then there's a list that's really just like a click through of 75 things white allies can do right now just to move something forward. So there's no way I could come up with one book, even though we've put a bunch in the chats.
I think what I would plug is for allies. And I know this title deters a lot of people, but White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo is well worth reading if you want to be a good ally. There are parts in it that I can imagine some people being like, what? No. But really, like, think about it, push and engage in it. It is worth the time to think about what she's saying to white people. And for those of us who are not white, like it's a good book to engage with as well, to be a good ally.
Can I add one thing? The reason I mentioned fiction too, or some other types of books that also show positive ways that Black people move through the world, because we are scientists and we are doctors and we are lawyers and, you know, we are politicians and we are, you know, excellent students. And so I want to make sure people are also seeing who we are while they're learning what to unpack and dismantle. That's really important to me.
Excellent. These are excellent books. I know most of them were listed in the chat. We'll put them up on our website also on the Lunch and Learn page. So if you all who are watching today go back to our website and check back on that page, you'll see the list posted there of all the resources that were mentioned today. It's getting close to time to end this program, and I want to thank you all so much for being a part of this conversation. Really, your candidness and your honesty is really appreciated. I want to thank everyone who joined in for this program, who took an hour of your day to listen and learn, and hopefully this is just the beginning of these conversations. We couldn't offer programs like this one without all of our supporters, and I just want to put in a small plug. If you're able, please consider making a donation on the Holocaust Center's website so we can continue to offer programs like this one. At the Holocaust Center for Humanity, it takes a motivated and dedicated team to offer our many programs, like our Speakers Bureau, our teacher training, educational resources, virtual book discussions, and lunch and learn programs like today. And I want to give a special thank you to Richard Green, our Museum and Technology Director, who's running the technical side of the show, and also our leader, our Executive Director, Dee Simon, and our entire team, Nicole Bella, our Director of Development, Lori Marshall-Cohen, who runs our Legacy Speakers program, our education team, Julia Thompson, Paul Regelbrug, and Rosa Campos, Amanda Davis, our Senior Operations and Engagement Officer, and our development team, Sydney Draytel and Ellie Selesky, and our Administration Coordinator, Katie Lawrence. I hope you all will come back and join us next Tuesday at the same time for a special program with Barbara West, who's the daughter of a Holocaust survivor, Steve Adler, who's was a longtime member of our Speakers Bureau and was a survivor of the Holocaust, who survived because he was part of the Kindertransport that went to England. The following week, we have a very special program as well. It's the author of Olympic Pride and American Prejudice. So I hope you will join us the following week as well. So thank you again for being a part of today's conversation, and we hope to see you all again next week. And thank you again to our panelists. This concludes our program for today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.